Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing something really ambitious. We are setting out to dissect an absolute geopolitical giant, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. For 69 years, the Soviet Union stood at this colossal, transcontinental superpower that honestly fundamentally shaped the entire 20th century. Our goal today is to examine the state with strict objectivity. We're going to rely purely on historical data and direct sources to understand how it was built, how it actually functioned on a day-to-day basis, and ultimately, why it fell apart.
Okay, let's dive into this. Because the very first thing we have to understand, the thing you really have to wrap your head around, is the sheer, unprecedented scale of the USSR. At over 22.4 million square kilometers, it was the largest country on Earth, literally covering a sixth of the planet's land surface and stretching all the way across Eurasia. I mean, we're talking about a single nation that spanned 11 time zones and was made up of 15 constituent republics. It had the world's longest border, rubbed shoulders with 12 different countries, and held environments that ranged from frozen, desolate tundras to vast, scorching deserts. The geography alone made it an empire of just staggering proportions.
To make sense of a nation this massive, we've broken our explainer down into 5 distinct parts. First, the birth of the Union. Second, the one-party state. Third, superpower achievements and might. Fourth, the economy and daily life. And finally, its collapse and complex legacy. All right, let's kick things off with Part 1, Birth of the Union, the Rise from Revolution. You know, the foundation of the superpower was born out of just pure, tremendous turbulence and revolutionary fire. Its roots lie in the October Revolution of 1917, when Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power, eventually establishing the world's very first constitutionally communist state. After a brutal civil war, the USSR was officially formed in 1922 through the Treaty of Creation. Flash forward to the late 1920s, and Joseph Stalin had assumed dictatorial control, driving the country through a period of incredibly rapid, forced industrialization. But the ultimate test of this newly forged empire arrived in 1941, when Nazi Germany launched the largest land invasion in human history, tearing open the devastating Eastern Front of World War II. And the human cost of that conflict? It is honestly almost beyond comprehension. The Soviet Union suffered around 27 million casualties during World War II. That is the highest death toll of any single country in the entire war. This staggering, heartbreaking sacrifice was absolutely decisive in defeating the Axis powers. In the aftermath, the Red Army occupied much of Central and Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union consolidated those territories into a buffer of satellite states. It was this hard-won victory, paid for with rivers of blood, that permanently cemented the USSR's post-war status as a global superpower. Moving right along to Part 2, the one-party states, governance and reality. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the incredible paradox it reveals about how the Soviet state functioned. On paper, or de jure, the Soviet Union looked like a standard republic. It had a constitution, it had an elected legislature called the Supreme Soviet, and it explicitly guaranteed civil rights to its citizens. But de facto, in reality, it was an entirely different story. There was absolutely no separation of powers. The state was heavily centralized and totally dominated by the Communist Party. The major decisions were made by an elite group called the Politburo. Elections were famously uncontested, and the whole system operated on something called democratic centralism, which basically meant strict, unquestioning obedience to higher bodies. To keep this massive machine running and maintain control, the state relied heavily on the KGB and its predecessor agencies to suppress any political dissent, using an extensive network of informers to enforce a totalitarian grip over everyday life. And keep in mind, this control was exerted over a remarkably diverse population. If we look at census data from 1989, we see that while East Slavs, so Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, made up about 70% of the population, 17% were Turkic, and another 13% belonged to various other groups. The USSR wasn't just Russia. That's a huge misconception. It was a highly diverse, multinational state containing over 100 distinct ethnic groups. While the state heavily promoted this utopian image of absolute equality, in practice, ethnic Russians were generally overrepresented in positions of power. And as we'll see, this complex web of different nationalities would eventually fuel some really deep internal tensions. So, what actually happened when ordinary citizens tried to claim those rights they supposedly had on paper? Well, this quote vividly illustrates the chilling reality of the Soviet justice system.
when dissident Sergei Kovalev, along with other prisoners, attempted to use the Soviet constitution as a legal basis for complaining about their abuse, a Soviet prosecutor actually looked at him and said, "The Constitution was written not for you, but for American Negroes, so that they know how happy the lives of Soviet citizens are." It's incredibly revealing. Under Soviet legal theory, the law was really just considered an arm of politics. Human rights weren't seen as inherent natural protections for the individual against the government. Rather, the state was seen as the source and ultimately the beneficiary of all rights. Which brings us to part 3, superpower achievements and might.
Despite all that intense internal repression we just covered, the empire really did achieve some phenomenal heights. The Soviet Union placed a massive systemic emphasis on science and technology, viewing it as the ultimate way to prove they could overtake the capitalist West. And that unparalleled state support led to some stunning world-leading achievements, especially in the space race. I mean, they launched the world's very first satellite, Sputnik 1, back in 1957. Then, in 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to ever journey into space. And later, in 1986, they launched Mir, which was the first continuously inhabited orbital station. These were not just scientific milestones. They were massive, highly publicized ideological victories on the global stage. But of course, this scientific brilliance had a terrifying shadow. During the Cold War, the bitter struggle for global dominance against the United States drove an unprecedented arms race. By 1986, the Soviet Union possessed a peak arsenal of over 40,000 nuclear warheads. 40,000. That is the largest nuclear arsenal in human history. They also maintained the world's largest standing military and developed the most extensive chemical and biological weapons programs ever recorded. The USSR was, without a doubt, a true military hegemon. Let's pivot to part 4, economy and daily life, where we see some incredibly stark contrasts. So, the crucial point is understanding how this all translated to the average person. We've seen the space stations and the nuclear stockpiles, but what was life actually like? To get that, you have to understand the Soviet command economy. Instead of a free market dictating what gets made and sold, the government completely centralized production and distribution. They directed everything through rigid, multi-year plans managed by a massive state agency called Gosplan. Now, on one hand, this system was incredibly effective at brute forcing a largely agrarian peasant society into a massive industrial giant capable of defeating Nazi Germany. But on the other hand, because every single economic decision came from top political leadership, the economy almost entirely prioritized the military and heavy industry. The actual day-to-day demands of everyday consumers were largely ignored. Now, to be fair, the state did take full responsibility for the baseline survival of its citizens. Following the revolution, public health across the empire was in an absolutely dire state. Vladimir Lenin famously declared, either the lice will defeat socialism or socialism will defeat the lice. It was a battle for basic hygiene and survival. In response, the Soviets established a truly revolutionary system for the time. Healthcare was entirely controlled by the state and provided to every single citizen completely free of charge. And initially, this led to massive leaps in life expectancy and the successful eradication of a lot of widespread diseases. However, as the decades wore on, that rigid command economy totally failed to innovate or provide quality everyday goods. Just look at this highly specific but incredibly memorable metric. By 1991, the average 35-year-old Soviet citizen had 12 to 14 cavities, fillings, or missing teeth. You might wonder why? Because despite being able to engineer rockets that put human beings into orbit, the Soviet economy simply couldn't reliably produce decent toothbrushes or readily available high-quality toothpaste. It is just a perfect illustration of the stark contrast between a superpower's massive military might and its completely crumbling domestic infrastructure. And that leads us right into our final section, Part 5, Collapse and Complex Legacy. Let's move to and see how this builds. Because ultimately, a stagnant economy, those crushing military expenditures, and the rising ethnic tensions we talked about earlier eventually brought the empire right to the brink. By 1985, leader Mikhail Gorbachev recognized this dangerous stagnation and introduced historic reforms, Perestroika for economic restructuring and Glasnost for political openness and transparency. But instead of saving the system, these reforms accidentally accelerated its complete unraveling. Relaxing state controls caused economic output to nosedive, and newfound political freedoms allowed long-suppressed nationalist movements to suddenly surge across the republics. In 1989, Soviet-backed regimes across Eastern Europe's Warsaw Pact were overthrown one by one. After a failed hardliner coup in August of 1991, the constituent republics began seceding. And finally, on December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union formally dissolved.
The sudden collapse of one of the world's two superpowers sent absolute shockwaves across the globe, and you better believe other communist states were watching very, very closely. The Chinese Communist Party actually conducted deep, extensive studies into the failure of their Soviet counterparts. They concluded that the collapse wasn't just an economic failure. They identified 4 key lessons. First, Gorbachev's rapid push for democracy fatally undermined the Communist Party's centrality. Second, state enterprises were privatized way too quickly. Third, the end of the party's ideological monopoly led to what they termed historical nihilism. And fourth, they blamed the West for cultivating a peaceful evolution that systematically destroyed the Soviet system from within.
But what about the people who actually lived through it? This is where things get really fascinating. While Western analysis naturally focuses heavily on the economic shock and political oppression of the Soviet era, modern polling within Russia reveals a deeply complex, even polarized legacy. A 2021 poll by the independent Levada Center found that 49% of Russians actually preferred the Soviet political system, compared to just 18% who preferred their current system and only 16% who favored Western democracy. For a lot of people, there is a profound nostalgia, not necessarily for the KGB or the repression, but for the perceived financial stability, the shared economic union, and the undeniable pride of living in a globally feared and respected superpower. The Soviet Union was, in the end, an empire of staggering extremes. It was a nation that completely eradicated illiteracy and literally conquered space, while simultaneously silencing political dissent and failing to provide basic, everyday consumer goods to its own people. It leaves us with a profound historical question to reflect on. Did the sheer scale and extreme internal contradictions of the Soviet Union make its spectacular collapse entirely inevitable? Could a state built on such immense centralized power and paradox ever truly sustain itself in the modern world? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this deep dive encourages you to keep questioning and exploring the fascinating complexities of our history.